The prices are like way like low in comparison. We could like save, we could plan and then buy a home. Like it was all strategic.
I wouldn't say affordability has improved dramatically.
Ottawa's housing market was supposed to be safe, steady, reliable, and untouchable. But in 2025, that illusion shattered. Home prices are sliding, sales are stalling, and families who once bragged about record gains are now panicking over shrinking equity. The premier, once calm and confident, finally snapped on live TV, his frustration spilling out for the world to see. How did Ontario's most trusted market turn into a political and economic firestorm that even its leader couldn't control? The glory days of Ontario real estate.
Realtor Tom Albrecht says high home prices continue to keep many new buyers on the sidelines, either taking more time to save or waiting for prices to ease.
There was a time when Ontario's housing market felt like the hottest ticket in town, a non-stop party where everyone seemed to be making money. Toronto's skyline was filled with cranes, each one a promise of new wealth. Pre-construction condos sold out before the first shovel even hit the ground. People were buying homes they'd never seen and selling them before they were even built. Real estate agents were local celebrities, bragging about how they could flip a listing in a day and turn average buyers into overnight millionaires. It was madness wrapped in confidence, and for a while, nobody thought it would ever end. The stories were wild. A downtown condo launch would open at 9 a.m. and sell out before noon. In Ottawa, quiet suburban neighborhoods were turning into construction zones overnight, new subdivisions sprouting faster than builders could keep up. Couples who had once struggled to buy were suddenly bragging about owning 2 or 3 properties. Realtors wore designer watches, and bidding wars became entertainment. There were tales of homes selling for $200,000 or even $300,000 over asking, fueled by buyers who refused to lose. You'd hear of people waiving inspections, dropping cash offers, even writing emotional letters to sellers begging for a chance. It wasn't just a market, it was a spectacle. And at the center of it all were politicians smiling proudly, calling Ontario's housing boom proof of strength. Every rising price was treated like a victory. The premier and his cabinet would boast about economic confidence while cutting ribbons at luxury condo openings. Ontario had become the envy of the country, the province everyone pointed to as proof that Canada's economy was unshakable. Developers couldn't build fast enough. From Toronto's glass towers to Ottawa's growing suburbs, it felt like everyone wanted in on the action. For years, it seemed like the laws of gravity didn't apply. Prices only went up, and anyone who questioned it was brushed off as a pessimist. The secret behind the frenzy wasn't really a secret at all. It was cheap money. Interest rates were so low that taking on massive debt barely felt risky. Banks handed out approvals like candy, and buyers lined up for mortgages they didn't fully understand. Foreign investors poured in from all over, China, the Middle East, Europe, parking their money in what they saw as one of the world's safest markets. Ontario real estate became a global brand, and the excitement fed on itself. Pre-construction units flipped for profits before they even existed. People were treating homes like lottery tickets, and the wins just kept coming. There was an intoxicating mix of greed and optimism in the air. Ordinary people became obsessed with real estate, convinced it was the key to a better life. Conversations at family dinners, workplaces, and even weddings somehow circled back to housing. Everyone knew someone who had just made a fortune selling their place. Even those who couldn't afford to buy still cheered for rising prices. It felt like Ontario was unstoppable. The market wasn't just an economy, it was a personality. Bold, confident, and a little reckless. But what made those years so thrilling was also what made them dangerous. The higher prices climbed, the more people stretched themselves to join the game. Behind the headlines and glossy condo ads were families taking on impossible mortgages, betting everything on the belief that housing could never fall. Ontario's boom looked like wealth and power from the outside, but underneath it was built on fragile confidence and mountains of debt. No one wanted to believe it could crash. Why would they? Everything looked too good to fail. But in 2025, the illusion cracked, and the dream that once made Ontario shine began to crumble right before everyone's eyes. Ottawa's rise in overheating.
Not anytime soon. I mean, sales are up slightly over last year, but certainly we're not seeing lower rates fuel a ton of demand. I think there's still a lot of uncertainty. Prices are still elevated.
For years, Ottawa was the quiet one in Ontario's real estate family. Steady, calm, and dependable. It wasn't flashy like Toronto or risky like Hamilton, but it had a quiet confidence. People used to say Ottawa's market never crashed, it just yawned. But between 2016 and 2022, something changed. The city caught the fever. Prices didn't just rise, they exploded. Suburbs that were once affordable for middle-class families turned into million-dollar battlegrounds. Detached homes in areas like Barhaven, Canada, and Orleans were selling faster than builders could pour foundations. Ottawa, the city known for government jobs and boring predictability, was suddenly the new hotspot, and everyone wanted a piece of it. Developers couldn't keep up with the demand. New subdivisions stretched further out, devouring farmland and forests as families scrambled to buy before prices climbed again. Real estate agents who once struggled for listings were suddenly juggling multiple offers before lunch. Stories spread of homes selling for $150,000 over asking in hours. One couple reportedly sold their townhouse for nearly double what they paid just 3 years earlier, without lifting a finger. Overnight, Ottawa went from being Canada's quiet capital to its latest housing gold rush. And it wasn't just local buyers driving the frenzy. Toronto investors began flooding in, treating Ottawa like their next playground. They saw the city as undervalued, stable government jobs, strong rental demand, and room for growth. Pre-construction condos downtown were snapped up before they even hit the market. Open houses looked more like auctions, with buyers pacing nervously in driveways, waiting to see if their offers had won. Even first-time buyers, desperate not to be left behind, joined the madness. Couples stretched their finances to breaking points, taking on massive mortgages under the promise that prices would only go up. Everyone believed they were securing their future, but in reality, they were walking a tightrope. Behind the glamour of Ottawa's boom, affordability was quietly dying. The average home price climbed more than 65% in 6 years, a pace completely detached from wage growth. Teachers, nurses, and young professionals were being priced out of the very neighborhoods they grew up in. Families were spending over half their income on housing, yet shrugging it off as the new normal. People convinced themselves that debt was just another part of the dream. Banks kept lending, agents kept smiling, and politicians kept taking credit for a thriving economy. The Premier himself would call Ontario's real estate success a sign of progress. It sounded good in press conferences, but everyone knew deep down it wasn't sustainable. The mood in Ottawa during those years was electric but delusional. Investors talked like prophets, predicting endless appreciation. Homeowners treated their properties like stock portfolios, checking values daily. The city's skyline was changing. New towers downtown, endless suburban sprawl, and more cranes than ever before. It was wealth on display, but also pressure building beneath the surface. People weren't just buying homes anymore. They were gambling with their futures. The entire province was drunk on housing confidence, and Ottawa was no exception. It felt unstoppable until the first cracks began to show, and that steady, safe market everyone trusted suddenly didn't feel so steady anymore. Early cracks appear.
Yeah, I think a lot of the sellers have been kind of holding out hope for rate cuts that was going to stimulate the market, and we haven't seen it even with the most recent rate cut. You look at the September numbers.
The shift didn't come with sirens or sudden panic. It started quietly. A few listings sat longer than usual. A few sellers had to drop their prices, and suddenly people began whispering that things were cooling off. At first, nobody wanted to believe it. How could a market that had made so many people rich be slowing down? But by late 2023, the mood across Ontario, and especially in Ottawa, had changed. The energy that once filled open houses and coffee shop conversations was fading. Homes that used to attract bidding wars were sitting untouched. Realtors, once too busy to answer calls, were now chasing leads. The excitement was gone, replaced by something far less glamorous: silence. It started with interest rates. The days of cheap borrowing vanished almost overnight. The Bank of Canada, trying to fight inflation, began raising rates, and suddenly mortgages became a burden instead of a blessing. Those record-low rates that fueled the boom turned into ticking time bombs. Families who had taken on massive variable-rate mortgages watched their monthly payments skyrocket. What used to be manageable became suffocating. Buyers who once stretched every dollar to get into the market began backing off. Even investors, the same ones who once lined up overnight for pre-construction condos, started to disappear. The air of invincibility that surrounded Ontario real estate for a decade was evaporating fast. Ottawa, once thought immune to the chaos of Toronto's high-risk market, began to wobble. Government workers who felt secure in their city's stable market started to panic as prices dipped. Those who had bought in the last few years realized their homes were worth less than they paid. Realtors who had promised clients that values only go up were now fielding angry calls from buyers who felt betrayed. Developers delayed projects, banks grew cautious, and suddenly the province's golden industry looked vulnerable. The slow creep of uncertainty was spreading like a chill across Ontario. The warning signs were everywhere, but many still refused to see them. Mortgage brokers quietly reported an increase in clients struggling to make payments. Condo investors in Toronto complained that rents weren't keeping up with rising costs, and Ottawa landlords began admitting they were operating at losses. WhatsApp groups buzzed with anxious homeowners comparing property appraisals that had mysteriously dropped. Everyone wanted reassurance that this was just a temporary dip, not the beginning of a collapse. But deep down, people knew the truth. The party was over. By the end of 2023, optimism had been replaced with denial. Politicians insisted the market was merely correcting. Economists used cautious language: stabilization, soft landing, normalization. But the tone had changed. The sense of certainty that Ontario housing could never fall was gone. Ottawa's once reliable market, the one that had always been the voice of reason amid Toronto's frenzy, was cracking. Families who had believed they were safe were watching the ground shift beneath them. The housing empire that once defined Ontario wasn't collapsing all at once. It was unraveling slowly, piece by piece, while everyone tried to pretend it wasn't happening. The 2025 freefall. By early 2025, the whispers of a slowdown had turned into a full-blown alarm. The Ontario housing market, once the envy of Canada, was unraveling in real time, and Ottawa was right in the middle of it. Sales across the province dropped nearly 10% year over year, while listings flooded the market. The power balance that had favored sellers for years flipped overnight. Buyers were no longer fighting each other. They were bargaining, waiting, hesitating. The frenzy that once drove Ontario's housing dream had vanished, replaced by something the province hadn't seen in over a decade: fear. Ottawa, once called a safe haven for steady prices, was no longer immune. Home values slipped by roughly 4%, a modest number on paper, but devastating in sentiment. For years, Ottawa's market had been the quiet achiever, predictable, profitable, and stable. Suddenly, that image shattered. Sellers who had refused to lower prices were forced to swallow losses. Realtors began whispering about desperate owners accepting offers tens of thousands below asking. Pre-construction projects that were once sold out within days sat half-empty. Developers who had built their empires on endless demand were now quietly delaying launches, praying the market would turn before their finances did. Downtown Toronto was already in freefall, but what truly rattled the province was seeing Ottawa falter. The nation's capital had always been the responsible one, the one place everyone assumed was recession-proof because of its government jobs and steady economy. But even that bubble was bursting. Mortgage renewals hit like a hammer. Families who had stretched themselves to buy during the boom were blindsided by renewal letters that doubled their payments. Many couldn't keep up. Some started selling before things got worse. Others tried to rent out rooms or basement units to stay afloat. It was survival mode, and everyone knew someone who was struggling. Condo owners were hit the hardest. In both Ottawa and Toronto, maintenance fees kept rising, cutting deep into profits. Investors who had relied on Airbnb income were crushed by new restrictions. What had once been a cash flow machine was now a financial trap. Social media was flooded with posts from landlords confessing that their rental income no longer covered their mortgage. Some were selling at losses just to escape the bleeding. Those who couldn't sell were stuck, paying out of pocket month after month, waiting for a miracle that wasn't coming. The numbers painted an ugly truth. Listings were up 11%, but actual sales were down 9%. More people were trying to sell, but fewer people wanted to buy. Confidence had evaporated. The Ontario housing market, this golden engine of growth that politicians built their reputations on, had lost its shine. What was once called a correction was beginning to look like something deeper, something systemic. The air of wealth and pride that once filled Ontario's real estate scene had turned heavy with anxiety. Families were terrified, investors were silent, and the Premier was running out of ways to pretend everything was fine. The freefall had begun, and nobody, not even the capital city, was safe from it. The Premier's public meltdown.
Parliamentary Budget Officer tracks housing affordability based on the gap between average home prices and what the typical household can afford. The biggest improvements were seen in Toronto and Hamilton.
By spring 2025, the pressure was unbearable. Ontario's Premier, who had spent years boasting about a resilient housing market, was suddenly the face of its collapse. Every press conference turned into a grilling. Reporters fired questions about foreclosures, collapsing sales, and homeowners drowning in debt. The frustration finally broke through one morning when the cameras caught what would become the defining moment of the crisis. The Premier, visibly exhausted and cornered by tough questions, snapped. His voice cracked with anger as he accused journalists of fueling panic. The clip went viral within hours, spreading across Canada like wildfire. Overnight, the story wasn't just about the housing market, it was about a leader losing control. That meltdown set the tone for the months that followed. Public confidence in his leadership crumbled as fast as home prices. Protesters began gathering outside Queen's Park with cardboard signs reading, "We're house poor because of you," and "Mortgage prisoners need help." Families who had lost everything showed up to town halls, holding their property tax bills in the air like evidence. Instead of sympathy, the Premier offered frustration. During one heated exchange, he told homeowners that markets go up and down and that people need to take responsibility for their choices. It was supposed to sound firm, but it came off cold. The clip went viral again, fueling outrage and late-night talk show jokes. The image of a red-faced Premier shouting back at the people who had once trusted him became impossible to escape. Inside the legislature, things were just as bad. Opposition leaders smelled blood and went on the attack, accusing him of ignoring affordability warnings for years. The debates turned fiery. At one point, he slammed his hand on the desk, shouting that no one could have predicted this crash, a statement immediately fact-checked on live TV. The video looped endlessly on social media, shared with captions like, "A Premier under pressure," and "Ontario's meltdown, one clip at a time." Even allies began to distance themselves, quietly admitting that his temper was making things worse. Every attempt to repair his image backfired. In a televised town hall, a young mother tearfully described losing her home and savings. Instead of compassion, the Premier appeared tense, interrupting her mid-sentence to explain market trends. The internet didn't forgive him. Commenters called him heartless, out of touch, arrogant. Memes flooded TikTok and Twitter, comparing him to the very real estate agents and speculators who had profited during the boom while ordinary people fell behind. His approval ratings collapsed alongside housing values, and for the first time in his political career, he looked truly rattled. By the middle of 2025, the Premier's name had become shorthand for everything wrong with Ontario's housing crisis: denial, anger, and blame shifting. He had gone from proudly standing in front of new condo towers to dodging questions about why families were losing their homes. The man who once embodied Ontario's confidence was now its cautionary tale. A leader cracking under pressure as the province's greatest economic empire fell apart around him. So, what are your thoughts on this? Let us know in the comments below.